Fluent first performs the circumferential averaging at specific radial or axial stations. This defines profiles of boundary conditions of flow variables. These profiles, which are functions of axial or radial coordinates, are then used to update boundary conditions along the two zones of mixing plane interface. In the figure which we saw on the earlier slide, which is this particular figure, profiles of averaged rotal pressure, direction cosines of flow angles in the radial, tangential and axial directions, total temperature, turbulent kinetic energy, turbulence dissipation rate are computed at rotor exit and used to update the boundary conditions at stator inlet. Similarly, profiles of static pressure direction cosines of flow angles in the radial, tangential and axial directions are computed at stator inlet and used as boundary conditions on the rotor exit. Let us review the averaging methods now. First is the area weighted averaging. In this, Fluent takes a simple area weighted average of the variable to be transferred across the interface. The formula for area weighted average is shown here. The next is the mass weighted average. In this, a mass weighted average is taken for the variables to be transferred across interface. This method provides better representation of flow quantities than the area weighted average, but it may cause some convergence issues if reverse flow is present. The third method is the mixed out average. This method is based on the principles of conservation. It is considered to be better representation of the averaging as it also reflects losses associated with non-uniformities in flow properties. It considers the equations as shown in this particular slide. So there is mass, momentum and energy conservation equations which are solved for mixed weight averaging. What is the algorithm on which the mixing plane method is based? Let us see one by one what are the algorithm steps in this particular flow chart. First, the mixing plane method updates the flow field solution in the stator and rotor domains. Then the average of flow properties is taken at the rotor exit and rotor inlet at the stator exit and rotor inlet boundaries. By this, we get profiles for use in updating the boundary conditions. Then the profiles are passed to the boundary condition inputs required for the stator exit and rotor inlet. This step of 1 to 3 are then repeated until convergence is achieved. After we have seen the conceptual background behind the mixing plane model, let us go into detail of the MRF model. A pictorial representation of the application of MRF model is shown here, in which in this particular problem where we have the stationary zone, that is the outside zone, the rotating zone which is the inside zone, and we have the interface which is the dotted line or dashed line. Rotating zones move with prescribed rotational speed. Steady rotation is considered only in this particular problem. Boundaries which are contained within the rotating zone interface must follow the geometry rules for the SRF model. That is, the typical rules that the interface must be surface of revolution. It has to be followed. Also, we can employ the rotationally periodic boundaries, but specific angles of all zones, but the periodic angles of all zones must be equal. Surface of revolution is another important condition. Biggest thing to worry about the MRF model is where to place the interface. For interfaces contained within an enclosed systems, we choose the radial position midway between the tip of the rotor and the closet stationary wall as the interface location. For interface embedded in a large domain, we choose the location where the flow conditions are relatively uniform. So flow conditions are relatively uniform, and midway between the tip of the rotor and the closet stationary wall is an ideal location, and we have to avoid cross flow situations when we place the interface. An example of the location of the interface is shown here. The same problem we are choosing, and in this case the rotating zone is the inside rotating zone. In both the cases we have the stationary outside zone. This particular interface is selected seems to be correct, and in this second case interface is not a surface of revolution, so do not select a shape like this which is not a surface of revolution along the axis of rotation. Now let us study the interface types in detail. Two mesh setups are available. If the boundaries between two zones which are in different reference frame is conformal, there is one interface type which is conformal interfaces. By conformal interface we mean that the node locations are identical at boundaries where the two zones meet. In such case, we can create the mesh as usual with all cell zones contained in the same mesh file. We have to keep the different portions of the domain in different cell zones whenever we want to assign a different reference frame for it. Interior zone condition for the boundary between reference frame. If the boundary between two zones that are in different reference frame is non-conformal, it is known as non-conformal interface. This means mesh node locations are not identical at the boundary where the two zones meet. In this case, we have to follow the creation of non-conformal mesh procedure. The interface consists of two overlapping surfaces, type is interface, and a fluent NCA algorithm passes flux from one surface to the other in conservative fashion. So this is a particular example where we have interface is conformal here, but in this case, in the second case, interface is non-conformal. To create the non-conformal interface, we have to go to define grid interfaces. An example of a rotationally periodic interface type is shown here, where we have periodic non-conformal interface. Each zone has same periodic angle, that is 40 degree, and we can model the stator and the rotor zone. Instead of modeling the entire centrifugal compressor, we are only modeling a stage of it, and this thing repeats or is periodic. Now let us see how to set up the non-conformal interfaces, which is the next step in setting up the MRF model. We have to go to the create edit mesh interfaces, that is create mesh interface, define mesh interface command or option. We have to define the interface zone types in the boundary condition GUI. We have to go to define grid interfaces after that. Then we select corresponding interior zones and provide unique name. So this is the first, that is the name that we provide for the mesh interface, and then we select the interface zones 1 and interface zone 2. We can select options like periodic repeats. In this case, interface is periodically repeating. Coupled wall option. In this case, the interface is a solid wall. Example can be between fluid zone and solid zone, or two solid zones. And then we press on create interfaces. Interface may be deleted or recreated if necessary by using these options. The list button, which is available here, provides details of interface zones. We have to generate mesh with appropriate stationary and rotating fluid zones. For each rotating fluid zone, we select the frame motion as an option in order to activate the multiple reference frame model, and the reference frame tab opens up. The setup is very identical to the SRF model, except we have the multiple zones. So we have to specify the rotation axis origin, we have to specify the rotational velocity, we have to specify the rotational axis origin, we have to specify if there is a translation velocity. We can also hook up the zone motion function by UDF. Once we set up all these conditions for the rotating zone or the rotating reference frame zone, click on OK. After this, we set up the other BCs like numerical other boundary conditions and numerical discretization and solver settings in the same manner as the single reference frame model. And then the last step is to initialize our solution and run the calculation by pressing calculate. When we use MRF model, we have to be very careful whether the MRF model is actually applicable or not. Although MRF model runs in the particular case, it doesn't mean that it is applicable. There are some unphysical features also that the MRF model can show, as shown in this particular figure. Stable outlet vortex can only be predicted by the sliding mesh model. So what this means is some cases can be inherently unsteady. So when you solve MRF model, if you are seeing fluctuating residuals, this means that the case might be inherently unsteady, and you have to switch to the sliding mesh model instead of showing the results of MRF model, which can be misleading and give unphysical flow features. Now let us see what is the setup for the mixing plane model. First, we need to select either the absolute velocity formulation or the relative velocity formulation in the general setting, which you come from here. Then we go to cell zones, press on edit. Here we specify cylindrical velocity or flow direction components, that is, we specify frame motion. Then we can specify in the reference frame what sort of velocity specifications we need. We will need to define the axis of rotation for the reference frame. Then in the fluids panel, we also specify the rotation axis origin and rotation axis direction under the reference frame tab. Then we define the velocity boundary condition. We also go on to define other boundary conditions like inlet and outlet. Then we go to define the mixing plane. This is the most important task when we use the mixing plane model. This will open the mixing plane dialog box as shown here in this particular slide. Here we specify the two zones that comprise the mixing plane by selecting an upstream zone in the upstream zone list and a downstream zone in the downstream zone list. Then we indicate the geometry of the mixing plane interface by choosing one of the options under mixing plane geometry. So we can choose radial or axial. A radial geometry signifies that the information at the mixing plane interface is to be circumferentially averaged into profiles that vary in the radial direction. This is appropriate for axial flow machines. And axial geometry signifies that the circumferentially averaged profiles are to be constructed that vary in the axial direction. This is true for radial flow devices. After this, we set the number of interpolation points. This is the number of interpolation points. This is the number of radial and axial locations used in constructing the boundary profiles. For circumferential averaging, the number should be chosen such that the number is approximately equal to the resolution of the surface mesh in the radial or axial direction. Then we go to the global parameters. Here we specify the averaging method. The choices are area averaging, mass averaging, or mixed out method. There is also an option to under-relax the changes in the boundary values at the mixing plane. This can be done by setting the under-relaxation parameter. After setup, we need to click on Create to create a new mixing plane. Then comes the last step. In order to run the mixing plane problem, we have to set up whatever boundary conditions remaining. For example, in wall, we have to go into momentum tab and click on moving wall. If the wall is moving, as usual, we give in absolute frame. If the wall is stationary, we give absolute frame 0. If the wall is rotating, we give in relative frame. It is having 0 speed, which means it is rotating with the relative reference frame velocity, and it is rotating in case of in reality it is actually rotating. We also give no slip or specified shear conditions as well as wall roughness. After boundary conditions, then we set up the solution methods here, whether we have the pressure velocity coupling, what type of discrete spatial algorithms we can use, and we finally initialize the solution, and then we click on calculate in order to start the calculations, which completes our mixing plane setup. Let us see what are the solution strategies applicable to the multiple reference frame and the mixing plane model. In case of multiple moving reference frame, there is a possibility of interaction between the moving and the stationary components, which can sometimes be seen as a poor or oscillatory convergence. In such cases, it is strongly recommended that the sliding mesh approach be used to compute the flow field in order to resolve the unsteady interaction. In case of mixing plane model, if there is significant reverse flow, then the mixing plane model may not be appropriate. In some simulations, there is reverse flow during start of the iterations, even though at convergence there is no reverse. Then in such cases, we first have to obtain a provisional solution using the fixed conditions at the rotor-stator interface. There may be some convergence problems with the mixed out method. So first start with the area averaging method and then switch to mass or mixed out averaging method. It is also recommended to use under relaxation parameter to get stability in the simulation. Finally, we see some of the post-processing details. Again, there are various post-processing options for MRF and mixing plane model. We can plot contours and vectors of velocity, relative velocity as well as absolute velocity. These are contained in the velocity categories. In case of mixing plane model, you can also generate a plot of circumferential averages. This can be done by going to plot files setup. We select circumferential averages as the plot type, and we can select legends as well as we can select circumferential averaging. And this will allow you to find the average value of quantity at several different radial or axial positions in your model using the circumferential averages plots. So this type of plot can be generated using this particular option. So finally we come at the end of this particular session on the multiple moving reference frame and the mixing plane model. We have seen what is the MRF model and the mixing plane model in Fluent in this particular session. We also saw what are the basic concepts or theory of these models. We have studied the steps involved in setting up the MRF model or the mixing plane model in Fluent. In the next session, we will see the sliding mesh or the dynamic mesh model, which will be the last lecture of this particular course. Thank you for attending this particular session. See you in the next session.